Welcome to the All of Life podcast from Redemption Church Tempe, where we have conversations on faith, culture, theology, and beyond to help us live all of life, all for Jesus. Let's jump into today's episode.
Well, welcome everyone. It is good to be here for another episode of our podcast. I do believe this is the strangest one. Woohoo! At least for me, it's going to be the strangest one. Today we're going to talk about Harry Potter.
Yeah.
And we are going to look at Harry Potter and what are the echoes in the stories of Harry Potter that point to the bigger story, the biblical story. And, you know, we're going to have some fun with it. And,
That's right,
you know,
we are.
Not everyone around this table is a fan of Harry Potter. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce everybody, and then we'll jump in with the discussion. But I want to at least introduce everyone to who's sitting here at the table. So I'm Jim Mullins. I'm the person, the skeptic, who's going to be here at the table, and also will be facilitating our conversation here. Susanne Gonzalez.
Hello.
What's your role at Redemption Tempe?
So I am the Redemption Kids director and general fun haver as far as staff role goes.
I'm going to bet everyone who knows you, if they had to guess what side of the discussion that you're on, I'm going to guess that 99% would say that you are big
totally
fan of
against
Harry,
it. Wait,
Harry
hang
Potter.
on. Oh, sorry. No, definitely not. Absolutely love Harry Potter.
And then we have Havilah Wood. Havilah, what's your role?
I'm the curriculum coordinator for Redemption Kids.
Nice. And Havilah on our team says about 27 sentences per year, every single one of them very
26,
profound.
maybe.
Yeah.
It's about accurate, yeah.
All right. So, Jake, tell us about you.
I'm the student and young adult pastor here at Redemption, and I affectionately have been telling, especially people in high school ministry, that Harry Potter is a part of the reason that I became a Christian for the last
Praise God.
10 years.
Really?
So,
okay, we're going to want to hear that
I've been waiting
story.
for this podcast for a long time.
Yes. Yeah. So you've been waiting for it, and I have been not as interested in it. But here we are. You know, we are not, recording the video here today. There's a couple reasons for it. One is my razor, that I used to shave my beard, fell into the toilet, and
Yeah, I was going to say something.
I've got half a beard going on here.
It has nothing to do with your cut-off sweatpants that are stained in bleach and the food stains on your shirt.
Well, that's just normal work attire.
Well, I do appreciate your Bill Belichick sweatshirt today. I know the affection you have for Bill Belichick.
Oh,
no.
Five words.
Havilah, I thought we were starting off on the same team.
Never.
She's trying to win points with the Harry Potter fans because she knows she doesn't belong at this table. So.
Wow. Okay.
All right. So then we've got the other reason is because Susanne has came equipped with a bunch of accoutrements and
Yes, I did.
a
little show and tell.
What sort of things do you have on the table here?
So I do have my wand that did choose me at the Diagon Alley installment of Ollivander's Wand Shop in Orlando, Florida. Not the actual place of it, but the outpost. And so I also have my pygmy puff. It's a species of puffskin that was actually bred to be tinier, and his name is Samson. Also got him in Diagon Alley at Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, which is a joke shop. And I also am very qualified to speak on this, as I am a Ravenclaw Quidditch team captain, as it says on my shirt that I was very excited to show everybody, but apparently Jim's beard wins.
This right now was the exact moment that all of the people who were listening to the podcast because they like the UFC discussion just switched to a different podcast.
Don't do it. Get back. Come back.
They're already gone.
They're gone.
Suzanne. They're already gone.
I mean, was the title not a giveaway?
Yeah, I don't know. So
I'd be proud of you if you are, though. So if you are, stay tuned. This is great.
So here is how I want to frame this. I want to frame this, first of all, through the lens of story. So there's a guy by the name of Mike Cosper. He has written a really good book. It's called The Stories We Tell. And it's about how movies and cinema, and television shows, all these sorts of things are stories that are echoes of the bigger story. A good story has in it echoes of the themes of the true story of the world. And here's what he says. He says, there's nothing new under the sun. So, and our stories, no matter how fresh they might feel, are always playing in the dirt. In other words, rearranging the raw elements of God's creation. He says, wrestling with creation, reimagining it, working it, and making it new. Our stories have a way of lifting us into the bigger story of redemption that overshadows all of life and all of history. Because the bigger story is the dirt box in which all other stories play. He says, the storyteller's raw material is the stuff of ordinary, everyday life, relationships, conflicts, love, loss, and suffering. Behind the raw material is the bigger picture of which we are participants. We live in a world that was meant for glory, but is now tragically broken. We hunger for redemption, and we seek it in a myriad of ways. And so he says the reason why we are drawn to stories is because they have these echoes of the bigger story that we are longing for and that we are trying to understand better through all of these little stories. He'll also make the argument that not every story is good. Stories that are providing a different narrative than the way that the world really is, the way that God made the world to be, are not good. Things that call evil good and good evil. And so what we want to do today is we want to ask this big question of how does Harry Potter provide echoes of the biblical story? And primarily we're going to be talking to Susanne and Jake because they really like Harry Potter. And Havilah and I are, we're playing a little bit of a different role. So the goal of today is for you to convince Havilah that
Yay!
that Harry Potter is a worthy story.
And you should go buy it today.
Yeah. And that you have to convince me that it's an interesting story. So I don't necessarily have moral qualms, but I've attempted to read, mostly because of you two recommending it. And I will say, and I attempted to watch the movie too. I will say so far, it has provided this important role of curing any insomnia I have. So, but
Wow.
But here's the thing. That's happened to me before. And then Jake, when he explains stuff to me, it gives me a new lens and I'm super interested. So that's the goal for today.
All right.
So we'll ask you guys a bunch of questions, but then Havilah and I get to keep you honest and give our feedback. So before we jump into the broader stories of the echoes of the biblical story, I want to just hear from each of you, Jake and Susanne. What do you love about this book series? Is it the book series or the movie that's the bigger deal?
Oh man, what a foolish question to ask. It's the books.
Yeah,
It's the books.
Okay.
Totally.
Okay.
The movies do a good job portraying the books, kind of like all of them do, but it's definitely true in this case that the books are far truer to the story and better than the movies, though I do really enjoy them.
Yes.
So,
What do you love about them?
well, I mean, there's a lot of things I love about Harry Potter and the world. And honestly, it's the first fantasy sci-fi type, like in that vein, storytelling that I ever got really exposed to and connected with. It had the interesting, it came out in the 90s and it had the interesting thing where every year the books came out, I was the same age as Harry Potter. And if you've never read them before, the story matures both in writing style and in content and theme as Harry Potter, as the character matures. And so that has this interesting effect of growing up with this main character. That makes it really special to people a lot in my generation or around that time. But what I love about Harry Potter is the idea that there is another world beyond the very clearly visible world that you live in.
Yes.
And in the very clearly visible world that you live in, most people tell you that life is humdrum, thoroughly unimportant. You have minimal contributive value, and there is little winsomeness or mystery or beauty. But in the story of Harry Potter, that is true. And then behind everything that you see is an entirely very real world filled with mystery, magic, and I'm sure we'll talk about it later, but some of the core themes that I think, like Mike Cosper says, are true to human nature and the true story that we find in the scriptures. So I love them because, and I'll just say the reason that they have a huge part of me becoming a Christian is I read them in some of the hardest times growing up in childhood. And what the story of Harry Potter did was it gave my imagination handles to grab onto that there could be a world beyond what I could see. And maybe in that world, the characters would have far more importance to them. There would be love and there would be good conquering evil. And it clashed with the reality that I lived in. And so growing up, it was very much an escape. I don't think always those escapes are completely unhealthy, though. Sometimes I think they can, and this is what I love just about fiction in general, especially sci-fi and fantasy. They break all the rules and they say, pretend for a moment this is real when it's not. And then it kind of winsomely allows you to pretend a lot of other things. So you can walk away thinking, well, what if the world really was a different way? So that's some of the reasons why I really love them.
Yeah. Oh man, I got so many questions, but I think I'm going to just make sure we get to everybody. In other words, you're kind of saying that in our post-Enlightenment world, things have become disenchanted. And this is a big thing in philosophy right now, that there's a disenchantment with modernity, with the fact that we think that only the material things are the real things, and that anything that jars you open to say that the physical world is not all that there is, that there's a whole world behind the visible world that very much affects our lives, is a good thing.
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons that Harry Potter took off in the 90s. I really do think it fills in the gap that there's a spiritual reality in a postmodern world that says that doesn't exist. But I think as humans, it's just too bad. We long and connect and we're built for that. So I think it fills a gap in telling stories like that where we very much in our culture say, no, there are no stories like that.
Yeah. All right, so I want to pivot to Havala because you have a different story. Tell us a little bit about your upbringing and your engagement with Harry Potter books.
So I grew up in a pretty conservative Christian house, and as was kind of the trend in a lot of conservative churches, Harry Potter was all but banned. There was no book burning at my church growing up, but I heard of it. And so we just weren't allowed to read the books. And I never really had an interest in it. I don't get super into fantasy or sci-fi. But then as I got older, I exposed myself a little bit to them and started watching the movies. But due to some stuff from when I was younger, we lived in a town where there was a lot of spiritual activity. And we lived in an area that we moved overseas when I was about 10. So we were very obvious that we were Americans. And there was literally, I mentioned earlier, they wrote an article in the local paper about us when we moved to town. So it was, everyone knew who we were. Everyone knew what we were up to. And my dad was a pastor. We moved to New Zealand to start a church. And our whole family felt that we were kind of spiritually attacked when we moved to town, and that we were kind of unwanted, or the presence that we brought was just not appreciated. And I actually had some physical reactions to some of the spiritual world, to those things. So that was my exposure growing up. So for me, I could never just look at it as, it's just fantasy, it's just a story, it's just for fun, because I'd seen the real side of it. And when I started trying to watch the movies as an adult, that stuff all came back for me. And it just couldn't ever become enjoyable. And I honestly, from what I understand, is like halfway through, it starts to get darker and kind of more serious. And I never even made it that far. It was like movie number 3 or maybe number 4.
Yeah.
And it just, for me, was like immediately shut down. Like, I didn't enjoy it. I didn't want to expose myself to it. And so that's just kind of been my stance on Harry Potter, for me personally. And that's shifted a little bit over the years, but that kind of
after being friends with me, maybe just a tad, just a tiny bit. Maybe
I've adjusted.
Oh, now I'm really excited that you're here, Havala. This is really excited.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good job, Jim.
So Havala and Susanne have been good friends for a while, and Susanne,
Totally.
and you guys have had these discussions. Susanne, tell us about what you love about this book series.
Definitely not as like intense and theological as Jake. I was like trying to think about it and preparing for this podcast, but I was like, you know what? I just think it's a lot of fun. Like, I have so much fun reading them. I have so much fun with like the story and the like magical aspects of things. And like Jake was talking about, the world within a world that's like, oh my gosh, this isn't all there is. There's like this whole other thing. And there's definitely like kingdom implications with that. That's so cool. But I think that honestly, like, I just really like, it's like, you can wave a magic wand and you can make things happen. And it's so exciting. And there's like magical creatures and like all these kinds of like wonderful, fantastical things. And I enjoy it so, so much. And I was a little bit older whenever I started reading them, whenever they came out. So it wasn't like that's super cool, Jake, that you're like the same age as Harry was. Of like, we got to talk offline about that. But yeah, I just think that I have so much fun with it. And I think it culminated for me going to the park and like seeing it all in real life. Like, my dear husband makes so much fun of me to this day, because for my 30th birthday, that's all I wanted to do. And so I went as a 30-year-old woman to Harry Potter World in Florida, and I wept like a baby. Like, I was so excited and so happy. And it was just like this wonderful thing. And to me, almost like this like picture of heaven of like, this is so cool. And I get to try butterbeer and I get to like go shopping at all these places. And like, hear me, it's really like a place where you literally, like, the rides are great, but not like wonderful. So like, you're literally spending a lot of money to go and spend a lot of money at shops and things like that. So they know exactly what they're doing, but I love it. It's just like such a fun experience and like immersive, and I don't know, it's just this like beautiful place where you can go and just be like, yes, like brokenness isn't the end, like the mundane parts of life are not all that. And like, I tend to also see the world in a bit of wonder, and I love doing that. And so it just kind of like totally awakens that, and I enjoy it very much. And I have read the books like 8 times through the entire series, and I still don't get sick of it. Like, I actually, in preparation for this, I was like, oh, I guess I should read it again, and like got like halfway through the 7th book in like 2 days, and it's a doozy. So I love it. I love the just sheer enjoyment of it.
Okay, that's good. Let's jump in to the biblical story. So I want to take this in 3 movements: creation, fall, and redemption. Creation, what are the echoes of God's character? What are the echoes of the good way that he created the world that you can see in the book? Fall, what are the echoes of the brokenness that exists in the world, and how does Harry Potter help us to understand that? And redemption, of what are the echoes of redemption? The hero figures, the things that help us understand that. And then Havala and I will, sneer and jeer as needed.
Can't wait.
So let's start with creation. In the beginning, God creates the world, and he creates human beings in his image, so that humans are a reflection of what God is like. When you see human excellence, you see a glimpse of God. I would be curious just when it comes to J.K. Rowling's writing, with her as an image bearer. What aspects of God's character do you think are being reflected through her craft?
Sure. Are you going to go first, Suzanne?
Oh, I'm.
We don't have time for all this difference.
Fine,
Why don't you jump in?
Yeah, go, Jake.
Okay. I think we've already kind of hinted at it, but the idea that our world is filled with wonder and beauty is captured by the use of fantasy. So I remember a scene from the fourth Harry Potter that is quite unspectacular in the sense of not action-packed. It's a scene where Harry is trying to figure out this magical egg. It's like a secret key to this competition that he has in his fourth year, the Triwizard Tournament. And so if you've never read it, those details don't matter. But in a sense, he goes into a part of the castle where there is a hidden bathroom for high-level students. And he takes a bath. And that's the whole scene. But the bath is
Are we getting in a new moral?
No, we're not. They even say something about like being embarrassed about.
It's this huge,
whatever.
Yeah, it's this huge bathtub, and there are 5 different spigots, and each of them pours out a different type of soap sud that has this crazy property. Some smell good, some have giant bubbles. So that kind of scene, I think, does really well. Harry Potter tells a world where everything in it is completely awe-inspiring and new and mysterious. And what I think it does is it reflects, knowingly or not, that the God who created our world, everything to him is beautiful, new, exciting. There's nothing that God gets bored of. And what Harry Potter and fantasy does through that is it kind of re-sparks that by twisting the rules a little bit and makes you think about, man, bathtubs and baths are actually pretty amazing. Like God made a world where we can have rest and delight and joy and relaxation, and there are smells, but using these fictional stories, you kind of re-inject wonder back into the world. So I think that's one of the things that does it really well with creation.
You know, it reminds me of the G.K. Chesterton quote.
Yep.
He says that the world will never lack wonders, like beautiful, amazing things. But what it lacks is wonder, the awe to actually see those things for what they are.
Yeah.
I think I saw that on your Facebook earlier today. Is that like
totally.
That's been in there.
That's why it's fresh.
Yep.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, J.K. Rowling is quite unoriginal in what she imagines.
Yeah.
Every bit of the magic, the spells are just Latin words rephrased.
Yeah.
So if you got a light spell, it's like the word for light in Latin. All of the magical animals are cross mix-ups of a couple of different animals. All the scenes are just, you're in an old castle. And so there's nothing that's out of the ordinary. It just is kind of reframed in a way to kind of help make you go, oh yeah, the world is pretty interesting.
Yeah.
What would you add to that?
Yeah, I would say, just in the way that she is imaginative with it. And yeah, like Jake said, it's not like necessarily making up something brand new like God did with the creation, but she is using the things that God has created and her as an image bearer of like, okay, I have all these influences I'm taking from all these sources. I'm putting them together to make something different, but beautiful still. And like that points back to that wonder. And like, I did look up a couple of things to see like what she had to say as far as like gospel implications. And she's done a couple interviews where she has actually said that like the story was wholly like inspired by the gospel as well, but she didn't want to give away the ending. And so that's why she didn't like say something about it at the beginning. And I looked it up a couple different places. She did say that. So she was like, oh, totally. Like there's no question that Harry's like a Christ figure. And so, but I didn't want to give away the ending. And if you haven't read it by now, come on. But I think that taking from those influences and from those inspirations is a way that she reflects the image of God in her. And I love that. I love that she does that.
Yeah. What about, it in every good story, it says something about the way that the world should be, that I think is an echo of God's creational intent. Where do you see that in the stories?
The way it should be.
Yeah. You catch a glimpse of something, courage or wisdom
Gryffindor.
or friendship.
Ravenclaw.
Okay.
Hufflepuff.
I think friendship.
Yeah. These could be Sesame Street characters. I have no idea.
Jim, I'd say friendship would be a huge one.
Mm-hmm.
The three friends, Harry, Hermione, and Ron, link up in their first year and through all of school are close together, go through trials together, and their friendship has this love bond that is exactly a nice picture of how it should be. They go through horrible things. They sacrifice for one another. And despite how much they change over the years, they continue to have this commitment, like almost covenantal friendship with one another. And their characters create the entire story.
Yeah.
It's basically just 7 books on here's what these 3 kids did at school.
Totally.
So,
yeah.
Was that like the bad trailers or something like that? Of like the way to just, but no, I like for the, of like seeing things how they should be. Like I think of like that first scene, like if you look at the story of Harry Potter just from the beginning without the Wizarding World in there, it's like, here's this kid who is horrifically abused and lost his parents at an early age to a horrible accident, like all this kind of stuff. And it's just so hopeless and so dark. But whenever you see this, it's like Harry's getting a glimpse into this world of like, oh, I am well fed. I'm cared for. Not only is he cared for, but he's like the most celebrated, famous wizard ever. He just had no idea because he was like, living in a house where he wasn't appreciated, wasn't loved, was actually like abused and like had this like horrific childhood. So like, for him to be able to see that and to see like, this is the way that things should be. This is the right and good way. Like, I feel like there's, so many connections there to the way that it is following Jesus and living into his kingdom.
So yeah, it seems in the creation, there's not just order, but and that the humans are just sitting around, but there's also purpose and meaning as they are commissioned to cultivate the world and to engage in good work. And it seems like from before the 10 minutes or so that I fell asleep, he's stepping into a world where there's this restoration of shalom, the restoration of what should be.
Not completely.
Yeah. But then there's also, he goes from kind of a purposelessness to vocation, to a calling, to like.
Totally.
Created for something.
Yes.
Did I get it right?
You
like
did. I think you did it. I think you did perfect.
Proud of you.
How are you feeling about all this as they're saying these things?
No, I Susanne and I have been friends for a long time, and this comes up often between us. And I was chuckling to myself when you were talking about your 30th birthday and like how much Martin doesn't care. And Martin
he loves me, and my mother loves me, which is why they accompanied me while I was like bawling like a baby. It was great.
And I love seeing how much joy it brings you. And I like am right there with Martin with like I told him one time, I just want to come with you one time and watch her for the day at Harry Potter World or whatever it's called. Because I just think that would bring me so much joy. And I was thinking about last year when David and I were in London, I wanted to go find, there is a train platform with a 9 3/4.
Yep.
And like they've got like a trolley cart that's like halfway through the wall. And we ran out of time and we couldn't go find it. But I wanted to go find it and take a picture for you because I know it brings other people so much joy. It's just one of those things that like I personally can't partake in my life. Like it's just not something that like brings me any comfort or any joy. And so it's just something I've had to like leave. But I really enjoy listening to the two of you guys talk about how much it means to you and all the things you pull from it. Cause I'm like, oh, I never would have gotten any of that. Like I just write it off as like, it's just kind of another, I watch a lot of Star Wars in my house and I don't enjoy almost any of it, but my husband does. So we watch a lot of fantasy. So like I have a lot of exposure to fantasy. I don't pull the things you guys pull from it. And I love to hear other people's experience with it. I just don't have it myself.
Oh, I love you too.
Yeah. It's interesting because I'm, as you talk about it, I'm intrigued. I think my big turnoff was initially I went to a movie theater to watch The Lord of the Rings. And I was the only person in the movie theater who wasn't dressed up like one of the characters.
Yeah.
And immediately I was like, I do not belong in this world with these people. And any book that I pick up that reminds me of that moment, I'm like, immediately set it down. So, well, let's pivot a little bit to the fall. So it's nice to talk about wonder and the good things, the good creational things that exist in the themes of the book. But that's not the full world that we live in. We live in a world where, in the biblical story, humanity rebels against God and has the ability to take the good things he created and twist it so that it's oriented away from God, oriented away from people, oriented away from the good way he intended this world. And nothing is evil in and of itself, but it's just the twisting of a good thing. And so I guess I have questions on a couple of levels. One would be in the books, where do you see themes that help you understand evil and how the world? And because here's the thing. So that's the question. Because I think a bad book isn't something that portrays evil, because evil exists. But a bad book is when something that is good is called evil, and something that's evil is celebrated. So talk about the portrayal of evil and how you understand the fallenness of the world through this story.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What's the echo of the fall?
There is definitely not any sort of like gray area as far as like what the evil is in the story. Like it's very clearly, it's Voldemort. I'm going to say his name. Yeah, that's right. But
I get
Just
nothing. That's
It's
coming
fine.
out.
He doesn't get it.
It's fine.
I know
It's fine.
enough to know that you're not supposed to
The
say
people-
it.
He
That's all
who
I
must
know.
not be named is
Whatever.
his name in the book.
Oh.
But also, fear of a name increases fear of the thing itself is also in the book. So anyway, yep. So anyway,
Good sport, Jim.
he's a very, very powerful, gifted wizard, but he also goes through a lot of pain, a lot of brokenness, and you find that out as you read the series. And then when he does realize the power and the potential that he has, but instead of using it for the good of those around him and for like the wholeness and fulfilling of the world, he wants it to make sure that he is the most powerful, that he is the most celebrated. So honestly, it's like, you know, not to draw too many like conclusions there, but like with like Satan of being like, okay, you are a bright being of light, but instead of seeking flourishing, seeking wholeness, you seek things for yourself. And so there's definitely that like pure evil of turning something that you've been given, a gift you've been given, into something that is wholly self-serving. And he does that at the expense of the entire world. Like it's not just him who's destroyed. It's like all these people around him. He like brings up all this extra evil kind of stuff. And he's just is really like totally about the brokenness of the world and not at all about the flourishing, unless it has something to do with him or his own self-preservation. So that's a very distinct evil thing in there. And it is very much denounced as like, you do not want to take any part of that. And anybody who does ends up being destroyed. And yeah.
In a world where the self is worshipped and exalted above everything else, I feel like that's an important theme in moral formation.
Totally.
Yeah. What would you say, Jake?
Yeah, I think with what you were just saying, the self, the way that magic is set up in the books is that the positive is that magic is always used to further creativity and to better the world or in service. And then the evil is that magic is used to create division and autonomous power. Especially as you get later in the books, essentially what plays out is this animosity, hatred in wanting to kill people who are not pure-blooded wizards. And so it becomes this story played out where humanity is divided. Whereas the way it's supposed to be positively seen is if you are of the wizarding world, you protect, preserve, care for the world.
Interesting.
But later, as the story breaks down, this main character, Voldemort, his ideal is that the world will be filled with nothing but pure power, only wizards, and that goes on to corrupt. I think it does a good job actually making evil pretty complicated and not just one-faced. On one end, you've got, it just doesn't make sense. It's ugly, which I think is portrayal of evil in our world. But I think also that it's corrupting and entrapping. You get stories like Draco Malfoy.
I was just going to say that, the Malfoys. Yeah.
Yeah, you got a family who gets tied up into this evil, and the youngest boy who's going alongside Harry, who is just at first kind of like a school rival, but later gets into this role of true evil. You watch his story decline because his family is in it, and they're so putting pressure on him to save face, hold up the family honor, that later he finds that he is committing acts that he himself hates and watches his own character unravel and get destroyed in the process. But you feel for him because he's like trapped. It's like all he knows. And so it's a lot more complicated in how they show evil, which I appreciate. But yeah, it's the main way is that it creates division. And the role is that it's to have power unto itself, like autonomous power. That's what Voldemort wants. He wants to be so powerful that he needs no one. Even in the later stories, you see how he interacts with his cronies and his evil team is he goes on further to where he doesn't even need anybody, just in himself.
Yeah.
Which I think is a great portrayal of evil and sin.
Yeah. So I think that that's really compelling. It seems like it's neither naive nor cynical. I think both are distortions of the world. Cynical that everything is evil and naive that everything is fluffy and fine. But go ahead.
Well, yeah, one more that I think is just thought of. The ultimate evil in the story is Voldemort going on to separate his soul into these magical items 7 times. So
Horcruxes.
If he dies.
Jim, vocab word.
Okay.
If he dies, he could live again because he put his soul in this, water bottle, and that becomes a magical item. So the story then becomes that the truest form of evil is this one that fragments and dehumanizes somebody to the point that they are so split and they become less than even themselves.
Yeah. Wow. That definitely resonates with the reality of evil. But I wonder about if, there's something in and of itself where these books could introduce some subtle affirmations of things that might not be worthy. So like, Havila, when you were at your old church and they were like banning, they banning Harry Potter, it was probably because they had a sense that there was something about this, that it was a good craft distorted in some way by the fall. What was that?
I mentioned earlier that I went to youth group one time and they, the entire event that night was that we were going to debate for or against Harry Potter and whether or not the Bible said it was okay. So that was just kind of like a glimpse of what we were exposed to.
Where did the group fall? Like, give us percentages.
I mean, they split us in half and were like, here's the Bible. Whether or not you agree with it, debate for or against.
Sure.
And so there wasn't really any resolution. I was on the against team and I didn't have a problem arguing against it. I kind of walked away feeling like, being honest, I walked away feeling like the team who argued for Harry Potter didn't have very strong arguments and didn't necessarily have biblical content to back them up. I was also like 12, so who knows? This was a long time ago. But yeah, there was a lot of stories and a lot of for me, it was almost this addictive aspect that the books had, especially with young kids, that everything became about Harry Potter and stories of kids who were talking about these experiences they were having and these spiritual experiences they were having. And I think a lot of people would kind of lean towards like, oh, it's kids and they're imagining and it's playful. For me, because of the experience I had, I just couldn't ever justify that, like, it's just fun, it's just play, it's just pretend. Like, I let my kids talk about magic and pretend, and they're all into the superheroes and Iron Man, and and it's all pretend. But for that one, for me, it was a different level of like, this is real. And if you don't have an understanding of the truth and the reality behind the story, this fantastic story, it can be dangerous, I think.
Well, let me throw this out there to you two to kind of build off of what Havala said. You know, if you go to Galatians 5, and it talks about the works of the flesh, like the works that are essentially the fruit of a life that's oriented away from God. You know, it has things like idolatry, worshiping another God, jealousy, fits of anger, rivalry, dissension, things that you even talked about as themes within Harry Potter that are shown as evil. Drunkenness, sexual immorality, all these sorts of things. And then it says, against, and I warn you that those who do such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. These are contrary to the kingdom of God. And right in the middle of it, it says sorcery as one of the things that's named as a works of the flesh. Mm-hmm. And is there a way in which some of these books could be normalizing something like that? And here's why I think it's important. I think obviously you can look at super fundamentalist groups who are just like, watch out, everything's bad, and scoff. But I think there's a degree of scoffing that needs to be oriented towards the West that believes everything is just story and that there is nothing going on in the spiritual realm.
Oh, for sure.
Having lived in other countries, having encounters with the demonic, wake up in the middle of the night with weight on my chest and hearing voices and, you know, like these crazy things. We know that it is a real thing, that in the West, probably Satan's strategy is to just let us go on believing that these things don't exist. So yeah, what do you say about that?
What's the original Greek on that? Can we get a fact check? No, I'm just kidding. I'm totally kidding. I'm not going to be
honestly,
like that.
I was thinking about this the whole time since you first spoke, Havala, and like if there are more people who have that similar experience, what I would say. And I'm really glad you shared. To be honest, I would just say, like, to somebody like yourself, I'd be like, it's probably not a good book for you. Mm-hmm. Like, it's simple as that, because the sensitivities of your story and what you've gone through. And I'm so glad you shared, because I think it does bring up a real call and need for wisdom beyond just Harry Potter. But
totally.
This could be our case story, which I think is really helpful. Because I think you're right, Jim. I think that kind of like some of the scoffing, now our culture kind of mocks. Like, oh, you're the Christian mom who banned their kid from having a Harry Potter book. Which at first glance, my mom actually did the same. But then eventually it was like, oh, okay, it's fine. You can read it. And I think that's not unwise. I think you got to understand what cultural context you're in. And that first in Galatians, that verse, that the idolatries is really important to understand. I think some of us, absolutely, it might not be very appropriate or helpful for us to be reading these kinds of stories because of what it brings up.
Totally.
But my encouragement would be that you'd be just as suspicious of Marvel or your children watching sports games, because that's far more widely prevalent idolatrous within our culture than witchcraft is.
Now you're hitting that home.
I know.
With me.
I aimed at you.
You're
shots fired.
You're treading on some sacred ground.
Yep.
So tell me about that.
Sure.
Tell me how something like sports might be a permissible thing to engage in, but also has its embedded idolatry that's just as tempting or worse than some of that.
Oh, well, how does it? How is it like that?
Yeah.
Is that your question?
Yeah.
Oh man. Well, getting into sports, I think kind of our entire culture is set on this myth that pretty much every child is raised in, which is you can give gobs amount of time. You can cancel every night of the week and focus it entirely on practicing something that a very few amount of us will actually go on to do in extreme amounts. And you give your whole livelihood for this, this ideal. And there's obviously just such beauty and good to it. It's play. It's God-given. It's designed. But where I think you see idolatry in the sports world is you could just say how much time is committed to it, how much money is committed to it, and what are the other things that it overrides by default are just some of the signs that things might have gotten a little bit out of control. Like what you're saying, Havala, if you are noticing that, like if your children or yourself, it's becoming obsessive and you're saying addictive, that's just not something you ignore. It's actually a really good thing to be thoughtful of. Mm-hmm. And to pay attention to, not to just disregard it and blanket statement like, oh, witchcraft's not real, so no worries. Or, it's just sports, so no worries. But actually being thoughtful of these things. I think one thing to think about is it subversive is a good question to ask. If, like I would say for you, for Harry Potter, like it's probably not a good idea because of your experience. That's just not, you're not going to get to some of the benefits because those things are going to bring up a lot of those really bad experiences that are very real. So in my opinion, it just becomes no longer worth it. Mm-hmm. I mean, there are a lot of great other stories out there. You don't need Harry Potter. Mm-hmm. But yeah.
Yeah, it is interesting because I don't know anyone who's like really struggling with sorcery.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
But I know a lot of people who have made an idol out of sports, greed, consumerism, these sorts of things. So it's interesting. I think where there's a right skepticism in a lot of these, in a lot of circles, is that there can be the target on something like that, which is not as prevalent, but really a defense of idols that are even more popular.
Sure. And I think don't be lazy on this stuff. Like the blanket one now would be Marvel, and it's fine to obsess about that. And no worries, superheroes aren't real.
Yeah.
But the core of those mythologies is in a lot of
like
old Greek
Thor's
gods.
just kind of thrown in there like, no big deal.
And again, that doesn't make it just blanket then wrong.
Right.
It just becomes our responsibility as Christians to know the story well enough to know where to critique and where to celebrate. Because even in Harry Potter, like I can go through all the positives, but there are things that I could critique in how it is written.
I want to hear those.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Harry Potter feeds into the American ideology of triumphalism like crazy. The center of the story that it puts you into, the character is Harry, and you take on his, like you're following the whole time. He always wins. He is the center of the story. Everything in the entire like canon of those 7 books communicates that the world told you you're not important, but you are the chosen one, the most important.
Capital C, capital O.
and I think that is fine for the story and what it tells, but it's just something to be aware of. Like if you're an American reading that, it's playing into the triumphalism of our cultural narrative.
That might even be more of a temptation than sorcery.
I think absolutely. So
100%.
You need to be more thoughtful of those things. Like if you're giving if I'm reading it, I'm not likely going like, oh my gosh, I really need to go practice a spell. But I can say, even as a teen, I read that and went, I should be more important than other people think that I am.
I need to be a brave Gryffindor.
And not even in a really obvious, nasty way. Just in a, like, what it embedded into me early on and kind of what I assumed. Those things, I think, like you said, we assume there's nothing to these stories, which they are all very powerful.
Yeah. Stories are not neutral.
So
they are the most formative thing in our world, and sometimes subversively. Susanne, would you say that there are other ways in which something contrary to the creational good is promoted within these stories? Something contrary to the way God intended the world to be. It's elevating something that shouldn't be elevated.
I mean, stupendous point right there of like that kind of thing. And I like there is definitely that like communal kind of thing that I think that we are lacking in American culture a lot, of like looking out for not just yourself but those around you. But I think for sure like the light treatment of some things that have really super affected people deeply, like Havlo was mentioning earlier, or like the occult and like those kinds of things, they are treated very like woohoo, like very like whimsical, and not necessarily in a way except for some of the stuff with Voldemort, I guess, is like, it's like, yeah, there's certain kinds of magic that are just like super duper deep, and stuff that you don't want to get into. But then there's also these other things like transforming into another person is just like totally cool without their consent, or like all these different things of like they definitely are not, like, you're kind of like, huh? And also the idea that like, that like you're the most important, or like Harry is almost like, maybe he's not altogether flawless, but yeah, I think what you said was just like spot on, of like when you are reading those stories, you're getting it into your head of like, oh yeah, if this were me, then I would be all about this, and that like very individualistic kind of narrow frame of reference, instead of seeing it as a bigger picture. And I even think, actually, you know what? This is interesting. I'm just thinking this now, that it focuses unduly on like the British world of wizardry. And so it's like a very like, there's a couple of references to other things, but that kind of like elevates this one culture over the entire rest of the world. It's like, what's everybody doing now? And that, I mean, you could argue about like whether or not that's important for the rest of it, but I think that like elevating of one culture over another, and like these other cultures are like kind of seen in a, not so favorable light or something like that. And so I think that's definitely problematic for a lot of reasons. And so I could see that. But yeah, as far as like with like the biblical references to sorcery and stuff, I think that, what we already said was spot on, of like, that's not the only word in that list. And yes, that is problematic, but also greed and these things that are just so like entrenched in our experience as Americans, especially. I feel like we need to have a firm understanding of the whole biblical story before we launch into these other stories and see them as true or not. Like we can always, see things through the biblical filter. And I think that is a great way to do things.
Yeah, so it's interesting because as I look at this list, a lot of the movies and TV shows we watch are celebrating some of these things.
Reality TV. It's like all of those things.
Yeah. Dissensions, divisions, rivalry, fits of
envy,
anger,
jealousy, fits of rage. Yeah.
Drunkenness, sexual immorality, idolatry. And so it's this would probably be the least emphasized thing in modern Western culture. Sorcery would be, whereas the rest of those might even be characteristics to describe the goal of good television.
Yes.
So,
and yeah, it's like, I think that's what's hard sometimes, is that people are like, yeah, like, how could you do that, for those kinds of reasons for sorcery, but then are like, oh, it's just my guilty pleasure whenever I watch The Real Housewives. And I'm like, okay, then can we have like both? If we're starting with a biblical framework, if we're starting with that, if we love Jesus more than anything and allow that love for him to influence all of the things that we consume or what we see or how we see the world, like, let's let that be our starting point, rather than like completely condemning some things and then saying some things are like totally okay, or just like shrugging them off.
Yeah, but if you go down to the Tutsis and the Hutus, or where there was genocide, where there was ethnic violence.
Where are you going with this? I'm scared.
No, I think that some of those folks were reading the Bible in a distorted way, saying that their starting place was Jesus. And therefore, they didn't want to condemn the violence that they thought was redemptive in that situation by getting rid of the other tribe.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that there is a type of way of doing ethics right now that's really popular. And it's like, hey, let's just focus on Jesus. Let's just start with him. But then what it allows you to do is to subtly edit out other aspects of Scripture, rather than kind of like showing how to focus on Jesus is to focus on the full story. He's not just Jesus of the Gospels. He's Christ, the Creator, the Redeemer, the King who's Lord over all of life. And I think that's important to draw. I agree with you. As an ultimate, I agree with you. But I think that what I want to draw out is that what some people can do is take that statement and to define it in a way that allows Jesus to edit out the rest of the Bible that they don't like. But I agree with you. I just want to make sure that when someone hears that,
they're not like, thinking, oh, I can use this to justify also. No,
totally.
I'm definitely not on board with that.
Yeah. Let me land with this final question for you two. Where do you see the echoes of redemption in this story?
Mm-hmm.
The hero who comes to rescue. Yeah.
I mean, the biggest one is the crescendo of the final story in the final book. How is Harry going to finally defeat the force of evil? And it becomes very clear as he's sitting in the castle and Voldemort's outside calling for his death and to bring him out to fight him one last time, that the only way to move forward for Harry, because he has found in his journeys that his scar that he has on his forehead represents that the moment that he was born and his mother died for him and Voldemort tried to kill him, Voldemort unknowingly imprinted a fragment of himself onto Harry. So Harry was born and then took on and was imprinted with this force of evil unknowingly to him, carried it around his whole life. So in that final act, that moment, what he has to do, he realizes he has to go out, confront Voldemort, and let Voldemort kill him. So that in his death, his friends would have a chance at victory. And so he goes out to the Forbidden Forest, has that final battle, doesn't fight, lets the force of evil then point all of its force of evil towards him, kills him, and then, in death, we come to find that actually he is not killed, but the very thing trying to kill him, evil, is destroyed. And then he comes back to life.
Wow.
It comes to show that Harry didn't fully die, but the fragment of evil plate that he had on himself was destroyed. And so then to his shock, Voldemort is staying there defenseless, and they all come together, and then in that final battle are able to defeat evil because he was willing to go out and die.
Wow.
So I don't know what that has to do with the biblical story, but I'm sure maybe there's some conclusions or maybe there's some connections there.
You mean
I don't know.
Sacrificial death that defeats evil, that defeats death is
Yeah, maybe there's something there.
Yeah. Anything else you would add to that, Suzanne?
It's just so fun. I really like it. So if you've entertained doing it, I would love to.
Cocaine is fun to some people, though. It doesn't mean, yeah.
It's if you can handle it. I don't know. It's super fun, and I would love to nerd out with any of your children. If your kids are driving you nuts.
Harry Potter, not cocaine, right?
Yes.
Clarifications are
it's cool to see, like you said, Jim, of like the way that good storytelling is always a reflection of the story of the gospel. And I do feel like that's here, but also I want to affirm and encourage people who have any sort of hesitations with it or anything like that. But I think that was a good conversation to say, like, we should really be curious about all of those things that we ascribe to in this life and put it through the frame of the gospel.
All right, that's good. Havila, on a scale from 1 to 10, prior to this conversation, how worthy do you think it was to read Harry Potter books? 1 being not at all, 10 being absolutely.
For the average person, for myself?
For the average person. At the beginning of the conversation.
Beginning of the conversation, I like 2.
2? Where are you at now?
I'm in the middle.
5?
Maybe 5.
Maybe 5.
Maybe 5.
4.72.
Mission accomplished.
I think with wisdom and discernment as you're reading and conversation outside of just the reading and like not just handing a book to your kid and being like, go have fun. It's fine. I don't know what's in it. With that conversation and with that openness and that dialogue about the real side of it, if you're comfortable with it and it doesn't affect you the way it affects me, like have at it, go for it. But I don't think it's for everyone. And I think it's something that people should enter into a little more seriously than they do.
Yeah. And I would agree with that. And I would say that that's true for every story that you're engaging, and not just with your children, but with yourself as well, as having that reflective posture. On a scale from 1 to 10, I would have started out as a 1 in the level of interest. And I think you've moved me to a 7.
Okay.
So
exciting. That's a number of Harry Potter books there. Also,
it
God likes the number 7.
6.
No, sorry. God loves the number 7 too.
Sam's killing it right now.
That's great to hear, Jim.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining in on this conversation. We look forward to the next time we pick a topic to look at through the lens of the biblical story. Perhaps one slightly more in my wheelhouse, but nevertheless, I really appreciated you all jumping on.
Aw, thanks for having us, Jim. It was so fun.
All right. So what you did not know is that Stephen Collins has been in this room the whole time. He's one of the guys on our team.
Lurking in the shadows.
And he looks like Harry Potter.
Fact.
He looks like Harry Potter got in a time machine and went to the 50s.
50s Potter.
And then at the end of the podcast, he hits us with this gem about some dark arts, mumbo jumbo stuff. I don't know what it is, but it sounded really profound. And like the people who were Potter fans were like really resonating. So we need you to say this, and then this will end our podcast.
Go.
I don't. Okay, sure.
Just say it.
Just say it.
Just say it. When talking about like where do we see echoes of creation versus the fall, magic I think is a parallel to the spiritual world of our world. That there is a reality of there is good and there's evil with the spiritual world. Just like in magic, there is good and there's evil. There's a dark arts to it. And in the world of Hogwarts, where they're going to school, there's no, hey, let's participate in the dark arts. There's only one class, and it's defense against the dark arts. Where we see echoes of the true story is this is something to defend against, not participate in. And also what we see is pretty much exclusively across the board, the villains in the story are dabbling in the dark arts, are taking it on, are participating in it, and then using it to harm others. Whereas the heroes and those who are fighting for good never use it to fight against others, but they're doing it and defending against the dark arts for the sake of the world. And so I think that's a huge echo of the biblical story that there is evil. There is if you want to say like a demonic, there is a form of magic that is absolutely not to be participated in. And we see there's a line that the protagonist will not cross. And it is this dark. There are characters that do, but they're like anti-heroes and stuff. But there's like, it's clearly presented in this story that this is not something to entertain, not something to mess with, not something to participate in. And we would say as Christians, like the spiritual world, like there's a demonic reality to this that is not to be trivialized, not to be dabbled in, not to be participating in. The ends, the means don't the ends don't justify the means. Like here, like there's a reality of like this is off limits to those who would follow Christ. And I would say like that is echoed in this story.
Well, that just confirms to me that we definitely should have had you on this podcast, and we missed the boat on it. And so thanks, everyone, for tuning in for our second ending. We'll see you all later. Okay. Stephen hit us with another gem just when we thought we were done. We gave another 5 minutes of fun banter about comedians talking about Hogwarts, and then he dropped us with this other piece of knowledge. If you have anything else, now is the time, because this is really helpful.
Next time,
but hit us with what you just said.
Because some people might be saying, wait, we didn't like talk about that Galatians part. Like sorcery is sinful. Like what are we talking about here? I would argue that what Harry Potter's doing is not sorcery. This isn't like, we look in the Bible, what people are doing with sorcery, whether it's in the New Testament Acts where you have a sorcerer, whether you've got practicing magic, or in the Old Testament, there's a reality of they're pulling on the spiritual realm. And there's a reality of like demonic influence. Whereas in Harry Potter, there's none of that. It's just some people have the ability to do it. And there's no background of these people are pulling from some spiritual reality. Whereas when the New Testament's talking about this, it's not that some people just have an ability and some people don't. There are some people that are dabbling and engaging with demons. And there's a reality of like providing abilities that would not happen through natural, just personal ability. And so what Harry Potter is doing is not a demonic, spiritual, like tapping into this source. It's just suspending disbelief. It's like some people have this ability, some people don't, but there's no like insidious reality behind. It's more random with some of this. Or there's some people that just have this ability, some people don't. So I'd say the New Testament isn't critiquing something like that. It's critiquing you're joining yourself in with the demonic and able to do things that you wouldn't normally be able to do.
Yeah, so it's kind of like it'd be correlated to C.S. Lewis's use of magic in that it correlates with gifts
Yes.
Well, thanks everyone for tuning into our third ending. Hopefully this will be our last. Stephen, you better not have anything else to say. We'll talk to you all later. Bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the All of Life podcast. To get more information on Redemption Church Tempe, you can download the Redemption Tempe app, or you can send an email to tempe@redemptionaz.com.